In June 1960, actress Anna May Wong's last film was released. She spent most of her successful career battling discrimination from the government and society. Hollywood films were terrible at portraying Asian Americans and often portrayed them in an inauthentic and stereotypical light. And today, opportunities for Asian American actors are growing, but authentic portrayals are still too few and far between. And despite successes like Crazy Rich Asians, Asian Americans are still vastly underrepresented on screen and popular culture, leaving young Asian Americans in a crisis of underrepresented role models. I'm Yoonj Kim, and over the next few weeks, we'll be drawing parallels between these significant moments in history and what we see going on today. I'll be in conversation with Theo Gonzalves, the interim director of Smithsonian's Asian Pacific American Center and curator at the National Museum of American History. So, Theo, first please tell us about Anna May Wong. I believe she was the first Asian American superstar.
That's right. Yeah, when we think about early Hollywood, Anna May Wong plays a big role in our film history. As a Chinese American woman in Los Angeles, she really begins her career at the beginning of the 20th century. So she's appearing in film during a really fraught time where there's some serious attitudes against Asian Americans and specifically Chinese Americans. And she's trying to navigate a career in this industry where there are not that many roles for Asian American women or for Asian Americans as a whole.
Right, and speaking of using entertainment to, I guess, further Asian American history or Asian American culture and portrayals, that's something that Anna May Wong tried to do, but it was hard, I believe, because there weren't many roles for her to take. So for her, the act of standing up for Asian Americans was to turn down roles that were sometimes stereotypical, including when she wasn't given the main role of Olan in The Good Earth for MGM.
That's right.
Could you tell us about that?
Right. Well, by this time, her reputation is growing as an actor, and she's actually getting roles and becoming more famous and actually being paid as a leading star. But those roles were really circumscribed. I mean, they're oftentimes, by our contemporary standards, they're highly stereotypical. And what we find are the kinds of roles could be classified as either hypersexualized or hyper-violent. And this would apply to women. And the image that we would get from Hollywood during this early time would be images that she'd be part of. And so she actively recoiled against that. I mean, she spoke openly about the stereotypical roles. When she was up for this role, for the lead, it was given to a white woman who applied tape to her eyes. That actor ended up winning the Oscar for that role. And so it represents a lost opportunity for us to think about Anna May Wong, to see her fully and to see her talents fully expressed on the screen. And I guess that's one of the problems of thinking about stereotypes. It's not as if we can't find examples of people who are hyper-violent or hyper-sexualized, but in the way that film has treated persons of color, and specifically Asian Americans, it's really restricted them to very narrow views of who they could be.
Right.
And as a result, that's the problem with stereotypes. The problem is not that they're inaccurate. The problem is that they don't represent us for who we are fully. It really feeds into your psyche if you are not able to see yourself fully human on film. Imagine that for decades. You're not able to see yourself outside of these very stereotypical roles. And so what do you think the rest of the culture is going to expect from people, expect from Asian Americans? And so this was faced not only by Anna May Wong, but it was also faced by people like Sessue Hayakawa, who, as a Japanese-born actor who comes to the United States, and he's gaining all kinds of popularity, but also the anti-Asian sentiment is starting to creep up again.
Right.
This country didn't get a chance to see the full breadth of who Sessue Hayakawa was, Anna May Wong was, or Philip Ahn was. Imagine if we could embrace everything that they were, all the things that they could do on the screen. We just didn't have that opportunity because this country wasn't ready to embrace their full humanity, and that's a shame. That's the cost of what a stereotype is.
When did all of this start to shift for Asian Americans on screen? When did a lot of this, when did a lot of these roadblocks start to fall back in a way?
if you're growing up in that time, you're not seeing many parts of yourself on that screen.
Right.
You're seeing a lot of stereotypical images in westerns, television programs, in magazine covers and headlines, political cartoons. And so the culture is not really forgiving for a lot of Asian Americans. And it's not really until the 1960s and 70s that you see a whole new wave of consciousness emerging in communities. So it's not just folks that are organizing in communities for better access to education and healthcare and whatnot. People are also thinking about how to express themselves in art and music and song and dance, as well as film. And so you have the birth of an Asian American film movement.
Right.
And it's really quite beautiful and illuminating because people are telling stories that really have just not been told. People that are taking up Asian American narratives and stories in a really fun and serious way. People like Mae Wong, who would end up directing the Joy Luck Club in 1993. Not until another 25 years until you get Crazy Rich Asians, which is another
Right.
Majority Asian American cast. Before Joy Luck Club in 93, we have Flower Drum Song in the 1960s, which was based on the musical by Rodgers and Hammerstein. Along the way, you have these complicated figures like Bruce Lee that would present a strong sense of masculinity, of someone who stood against oppressors. He was always standing up for the little guy. And unfortunately, the industry created a whole stereotype around him. So while, and this is ultimately bittersweet, so while he presents the image of an Asian American male that's not emasculated, who is strong, who is standing up for others, that ends up becoming a stereotype many decades later, where countless Asian American actors are asked if they could be martial arts guy number 3 or gang or thug member number 4 in a cast.
Right, right.
And so again, is it the case that we don't know anything about martial arts? That's not true. But again, film has a way, and popular culture has a way of narrowing the possibilities of who we are and who we've been to the point where, again, we don't understand the fullness of our lives. And so we're
Right.
looking for the things that Viet Nguyen, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, has been talking about when he talks about narrative plenitude. The idea that we need multiple stories. We need as many stories as possible that range from the heroic to the mundane. And that's really the real test, is to see ourselves as fully human.
And beyond Hollywood, I also want to talk about the impact that the news media had on depictions and treatment of Asian Americans. What are some of the newspapers and some of their coverage that impacted the way that American culture saw Asian Americans?
Right.
Especially during the Vietnam War.
Yeah. When you treat people as the enemy, you dehumanize them, because there's no other way to treat an enemy. That's the whole idea about thinking of overcoming them. They do not deserve humanity. You have to create a sense of them as animal, as less than, as other, as foreign, as someone who is not of this place and who should be excluded.
I think we can draw parallels also to what we're seeing with the coronavirus reporting, with some of the news media in this country, falsely conflating Chinese people with the coronavirus,
Right.
or calling it names like the Kung Flu virus.
Right.
What lessons can we learn from these historical examples we just discussed for what's happening today?
Yeah, the lessons are clear, I think. One, that it's a cycle, that it's happened before, that this is nothing new. This sense of nativism needs to be checked because it is part of American history. Even though many people say that this is un-American, this has happened before in America, multiple times, in multiple places.
So what else can we do to counteract and get ahead of these inaccurate representations of Asian Americans in media?
Well, this is why I work at a museum. This is why for almost 30 years I was a college professor. We need to keep educating each other about our stories wherever we can, in film, in media, in literature, in music. There's not going to be a quick fix to any of this. Like I said, because this has been embedded in so much of our history, we also need to embed ourselves in the telling of our stories. And we need to really dig in, do some homework, get with each other, and to tell these stories as much as possible.
What other modes of activism are we seeing today from prominent Asian Americans to bring light not just to our own issues, but ongoing civil rights issues?
Right. Well, one story we're tracking at the Smithsonian is the story of Naomi Osaka's U.S. Open 2020 win. And what was fascinating about that is that this young champion of Japanese and Haitian origin was able to do so in a very powerful and loud way without ever saying a word. She came onto the court and she wore these 7 masks for each of the 7 matches that she attended, and each portrayed the name of a different person who was affected by violence, from Breonna Taylor to George Floyd. So it's a really powerful statement.
Yes, that is a really powerful example of an individual not only shaping their narrative and media representation, but using media platforms to raise broader awareness for civil rights issues.
That's right.
Thanks so much, Theo. It has been great talking to you.